Hello folks, my name is David Kramar. I am the Precision Agriculture Specialist with the Carrington Research Extension Center. I recently joined the North Dakota Extension in July of this year. However, historically I've had about over 20 years of experience in the geospatial industry, spanning public sector to private to academic. Today I want to talk a little bit about inexpensive vegetation indices for crop health assessment. And one of the reasons I find this topic so interesting is that there is quite a bit of information we can glean without necessarily having to have all this technology that goes into some of the more complex methods of crop assessment. So what are these vegetation indexes? Well, vegetation indices historically have been widely used to monitor both agricultural as well as forest health. And these indices generally rely on the ratio or inverse relationship between the red and the near infrared bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. This, of course, is a problem with a standard UAS platform, platforms such as the DJI Phantom or the DJI Mavic, for example, as these do not collect in the near infrared portion. There's a number of camera modifications that exist, as well as aftermarket solutions that exist, and these solutions range anywhere from a few $100s to a few $1,000s and up. The MicaSense 5-band, it includes a red edge and a near infrared sensor on it, runs about $5,000, and for the combination 10-band sensor from them, it's about $11,000. Of course, that also requires a more expensive platform to get these sensors up in the air for monitoring. So over the years, there's been a growing interest in non-near infrared indices, and these indices have been developed with varying success, and many have been developed with particular applications in mind. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get through them. So I guess the question is, what can we do using a standard 3-band combination, and what can we build on, and can we build on what we already know? You know, Phantom 4 or a Mavic, these are inexpensive UAS platforms. They have really good 20+ megapixel cameras on them right now. We can get exceptionally good imagery using these, and I think they're underutilized in the context of precision agriculture. Either people are not aware of the usefulness of them, or just simply haven't tried to work with them. So a little bit of NDVI, and most of what we talk about today actually builds off the concepts of the what's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And NDVI is based on the behavior of electromagnetic energy as it interacts with the plant structure. Healthy vegetation absorbs more heavily in the visible portion and reflects heavily in the near infrared portion of the spectrum. This relationship between absorption and reflection in the red and near infrared portions is what allows us to calculate the indexes that represent vegetative health. This method, of course, works well if your camera collects in the near infrared portion. However, standard cameras do not, and hence we have what I refer to as the not new problem. There are also downsides to NDVI. It's very sensitive to atmospheric, soil, anisotropic, and spectral effects, and that's been evidenced in the development of additional vegetation indexes that take into account some of this atmospheric sensitivity or soil sensitivity, anisotropic or spectral sensitivity that is inherent in NDVI. Of course, they still require the near infrared portion of the spectrum. So the first one that I want to talk about has been around since 2010, was published by Motohka et al. And it's the basic green-red vegetation index. This is calculated as the green band, or the green portion, minus the red portion, divided by the green portion plus the red portion. In green vegetation, green reflectance is higher than red reflectance. In soils, green is lower than red, and in water they are equal. This particular index is surprisingly easy to interpret and implement because using a standard NDVI calculator, we can simply replace the near infrared with the green band and come up with this measurement. Results match that which we can visually determine as healthy, not healthy in the imagery, and tends to be fairly granular in the representation. This performs well at both macro and micro scales. So this is an area of soybean at the Carrington Research Center. And what I want to point out is that we find areas like this that we can see over here. We have some variation in color that shows up and has greater contrast when we look at the vegetation indexes. And towards the end of this slideshow, I'll compare this with NDVI just so you see how this compares in terms of crop health assessment. Another field at the Carrington Research Extension Center, you can see we pick up bare ground, has great contrast from the plants, and we tend to see we have areas over here that show up very well over here. This gives us a good assessment of where things are at. The next one is going to be the green leaf index. This particular index was developed in 2001, and it's calculated as 2 times green minus the red minus the blue divided by 2 times the green plus the red plus the blue. The green leaf index was designed to adjust for the greenness and yellowness of the crop and was designed for low altitude monitoring systems such as UAVs. This index can be used and has been used for crops in all growth stages. This particular index is a little bit more difficult to interpret and implement simply because we're using 3 bands. We can't use a standard NDVI calculator to do this. So in ArcGIS, we can use the raster calculator and the float command to do this, but there are also open source alternatives that don't require expensive software, that don't require licensing and all this other stuff to calculate these. Not dissimilar from the green-red vegetation index, the results match that which we can visually determine as healthy or not healthy in the imagery. However, like most of our non-near infrared indexes, you have to be careful if you have water features. They do not model well without the near infrared band. As long as you're aware of this and are careful about it, it's not a huge deal. And not dissimilar from the green-red vegetation index, this performed well at both the macro and micro scale as well. Again, same field of soybeans. I'll show you, this will make a little more sense when we get to the end and I show the contrast, but we have good separation between bare ground and plant, as well as good differentiation in how green the soybeans are in each plot. This is contrasted. The second field is contrasted against the true color image again. And again, we see great separation, great contrast between bare ground and vegetative health or the plants. All right, the third index that I'll mention is what's known as the Triangular Greenness Index, and this was developed by Hunt et al. In 2013. This is calculated as the reflection in the green band minus 0.39 times the red band minus 0.61 times the blue band. And this was created in order to estimate leaf chlorophyll and indirectly plant nitrogen content using visible spectrum imagers. This is important, and this represents a little bit of a difference. The green leaf index was used to measure green versus yellow, whereas this is used to estimate leaf chlorophyll and indirectly plant nitrogen content. And your triangular greenness index is defined as the area of the triangle defined by the reflectance signals for the red, green, and blue portions. And we see that right down here in this triangle where we're trying to model out and account for the reflectance that falls within this red triangle. The example here shows less contrast than previously, but that's not necessarily surprising given that we're looking at chlorophyll as well as nitrogen. Again, the second field, we see the same thing. And so to compare with the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, here we have NDVI. And what's nice about these indexes is that while they do appear somewhat varied, we see some similar patterns among them. For example, in this area right here, we have a good bit of yellowing indicating poorer health. That turns up right here. In GLI, it turns up right here. In the VVI, which I'll talk about this one in a little bit, right here. In the GRVI, less so. In the Triangular Greenness Index, and of course we have our true color here. Same with up here. We see that up here. We're seeing that here, 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 and then again less in the Triangular Greenness Index. We see the same thing in this image as well. We've got good contrast, good differentiation between the bare ground and the plant health. If we look at our true color image, of course, and then look at what patterns we're seeing here, most of these are very similar in terms of what they're representing. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about the VVI real quick. I did not implement that equation in this particular presentation as I'm still working on it. But this is it's a rather complex model, but is also a scalable model. And if you have any questions about this or you have interest, please feel free to email me. One of the issues with NDVI is that it typically appears washed out, meaning that areas that may be bare ground kind of get washed in with the plant vegetation, and we lose some of the granular representation we have in terms of our pixel size. The VVI doesn't tend to do that, and we tend to get a much more granular representation, which is why we see, and of course this is true for many of the red-green indexes, we see this more blotchy pattern as opposed to this, which looks like continuous tracks. The Triangular Greenness Index also washes out, in fact, a little bit more than the NDVI. So a couple of conclusions here. We can get reasonable measurements of plant health without implementing the near-infrared portion of the spectrum. Without question, water is the largest confounding factor, and that's not going to change. That requires a near-infrared band. If you're not dealing with that, it's a non-issue. There are some cases where non-near-infrared vegetation indexes have provided a more granular or detailed output than NDVI, and that's similar to what I was talking about on the previous slide. Of the traditional types of non-near-infrared vegetation indexes, they each have their own strengths and weaknesses, and I kind of alluded to that as we were working through this presentation. You know, in terms of the Triangular Greenness Index is for leaf chlorophyll and to a certain extent nitrogen. The Green Leaf Index is used for yellowness versus greenness, so forth and so on. And to that end, it's really important to know what the indices were developed for. No single index is going to answer every question, but they can provide insight for better management. And oftentimes, it's just that little added contrast they provide that can give us additional information about our crop health. With that, I'm going to stop here. I hope everybody has a great day. And if you have any questions, my email address is on the first slide. Please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any questions, as well as just provide information regarding some of the open source solutions, ways to calculate this that are not necessarily overly technical, or even suggestions for how to acquire your own RGB imagery with some lightweight platforms. Thanks a lot and have a great day.